Welcome back to Collective Histories, my friends. So, a couple of weeks ago, we covered every 20th century UK Prime Minister's biggest mistake, and since I am a rather optimistic person who likes to cherish the memories of the bygone eras and welcome all of their greatest achievements as opposed to their biggest mistakes, I think we should cover every 20th century UK Prime Minister's biggest achievements. So, this means putting aside any political grievances I may have. This means accepting some of the Prime Ministers I don't like so that I can talk about something good that they did. And the criteria for this is it needs to be something which benefited the most people. It's not going to benefit one side specifically, it's going to benefit the most people. So, before we begin, please subscribe to Collective Histories. We have a lot of content. We seem to be covering UK history most lately, but we will branch out from this very soon, so be careful. And yeah, that's all. Let's begin. Arthur Balfour. Oh, and quick disclaimer, just like last time, we are only including Prime Ministers who were elected in the 20th century, plus Gordon Brown. And this means that our good friend Robert Gascoigne Cecil, who was Prime Minister for the second time between 1895 and 1902, will not be in this video, simply because he was elected in 1895, not in the 1900s. So yes, Arthur Balfour. Arthur Balfour's biggest achievement is often seen to be the Balfour Declaration, but I included this as his biggest mistake, and I certainly can't list it here due to the criteria of it needs to benefit the most people, and it's arguable that the Balfour Declaration benefited one group of people enormously and then did the complete opposite to another group of people, so we cannot use it under this criteria. But what we can use is the Education Act of 1902, and Balfour served as Prime Minister when the Education Act of 1902 was passed. This act laid the groundwork for the organisation of the education system in England and Wales, which established local education authorities and provided state funding for schools, which was a big thing at the time because the whole point of education at this time, it was a religious education specifically, and if you were from a poorer background, you would have less access to education. If you were from a rich background, you'd have access to high quality education, and this entire Education Act of 1902 was designed to make it more accessible, more available, and better at a lower entry level. So that's the Education Act of 1902, and we're going to include that as Balfour's best achievement. Other things which could have been mentioned were the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, the Tariff Reform Campaign, and that's just about it. Next we have Henry Campbell Bannerman, and his arguable biggest achievement is the Licensing Act of 1904, and this aimed to regulate the sale of alcohol in the United Kingdom. It was a response to concerns about excessive drinking and its social consequences. The act sought to address issues related to the licensing hours of pubs and the impact of alcohol consumption on public life. So the key provisions of the Licensing Act of 1904 include the reduction of opening hours. The act aimed to reduce the opening hours of pubs and bars with the goal of decreasing alcohol consumption throughout the day. Licensing control. The legislation granted greater control over licensing to local magistrates. They were given the authority to refuse or renew licenses based on the perceived needs and character of the neighbourhood. And then lastly, there was compensation, and this act introduced a system of compensation for publicans who lost their licenses due to the new regulations. This was intended to soften the impact of the changes on those affected. So in short, the act was designed to reduce the levels of drinking within the country, to make the people healthier within the country, and if this act had a negative impact on the business of already established institutions where alcohol was sold, then they would be compensated for it. So this was a relatively good legislation, and it's probably the best of Henry Campbell Bannerman's tenure as Prime Minister. Then we have H.H. Asquith, who was Prime Minister between 1908 and 1916, and his arguable greatest achievement, at least in my opinion, is the Old Age Pensions Act of 1908, which was a landmark piece of social legislation in the United Kingdom, and then Ireland too, representing one of the early steps towards the establishment of a social welfare system. The act aimed to provide financial assistance to elderly individuals, offering a means of support for those who had reached a certain age and were no longer able to work. And key features of the Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 include a non-contributory pension to individuals aged 70 and over who met certain eligibility criteria. To qualify, individuals had to have been a British subject, have resided in the United Kingdom for at least 20 years, and meet a character test, not having a criminal record essentially. And the pension amount was means tested, meaning that individuals with higher incomes or savings received a reduced pension or none at all. This approach aimed to target financial assistance to those in greater need. The maximum pension amount was set at 5 shillings per week, or 25 pence in decimal currency after the currency conversion in 1971. The amount was less for those with lower incomes, and the means testing ensured that wealthy individuals received smaller pensions. The Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 came into effect on January 1st, 1909, and it represented an important step towards the establishment of a social safety safety net, providing a form of financial security for elderly individuals who may not have had other means of support. And it laid the groundwork for future social change within the United Kingdom and is sort of the founding stone of the welfare state we currently have today. So this has to be not only a massive achievement, but Asquith's biggest achievement, in my personal opinion. There have been others he did too, but for me, this is the one which benefited the most people, so it's the one I have chosen to use. Next up, we have David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister between 1916 and 1922, and his biggest achievement was sharing my name. It's an achievement for me and for him, perhaps, but it's not his biggest achievement, because his biggest achievement is his leadership during the First World War, and I know that there are other things he did too, which could have easily been number one, such as the National Insurance Act of 1911. Yes, he wasn't the Prime Minister at the time, but he was the Chancellor who pushed through this. But there were future Prime Ministers who went further on this subject, so I don't want to put this as his number one. And again, he wasn't Prime Minister when he did it. So, his leadership during World War I. Lloyd George became Prime Minister in December 1916, succeeding Asquith, who had stepped down rather unceremoniously, and he inherited a challenging situation on the Western Front because the war had entered a period of attrition and stalemate. So Lloyd George adopted a more hands-on and pragmatic approach to war leadership. He established a war cabinet, something which Asquith had failed to do on numerous occasions, a smaller decision-making body that included key ministers and military leaders, which allowed for more efficient decision-making. Lloyd George then worked closely with military leaders, including Field Marshal Douglas Haig, to develop effective military strategies. His government played a role in coordinating the overall Allied war effort. He implemented economic measures to support the war, such as the expansion of munitions production. Lloyd George's government even prioritized the efficient use of resources to strengthen the war effort. Lloyd George supported the extension of conscription to ensure a steady supply of troops for the war effort. The move marked a shift towards a policy of total war where the entire nation was mobilized for the war effort, including the economy and civilian population. He also participated in key wartime conferences, such as the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where the terms of the post-war settlement were discussed. He worked with other Allied leaders, including US President Woodrow Wilson and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, to shape the post-war world order. So, yeah, this would be his greatest achievement. I mean, he led the country through World War I in 1916, having became Prime Minister midway through the war, and he played a big role in the victory, so this would be his greatest achievement, I think. Then we have Bernard Law, who was Prime Minister for 246 days between 1923 and 1924, and his biggest achievement, I guess, was that he was Prime Minister for 246 days and not 245 days. I mean, it's really difficult to decide what his biggest achievement was. All he really got to achieve was austerity during his time. You know, post-war austerity designed to smooth the economy after the war, and that's all I have for him, I'm afraid. I mean, if anyone has anything else, please let me know in the comments, because I can't find anything which he did, at least as Prime Minister, that benefited the most people. I accidentally said that Bernard Law was Prime Minister for 246 days, while he was actually Prime Minister for 210 days. This is a small correction. It was his successor, Stanley Baldwin, who was Prime Minister for 246 days. So, what is Stanley Baldwin's biggest achievement? What did he do in 246 days? Well, you don't need to worry about that, because he was actually Prime Minister for 3 separate occasions. The first one being between 1923 and 1924, the second being between 1924 and 1929, and then the third and last being 1935 to 1937. And his biggest achievement is arguably his handling of the British economy during the Great Depression. Baldwin's government implemented policies to address economic difficulties and maintain financial stability in the aftermath of the Great Depression. During his second term as Prime Minister between 24 and 29, Baldwin pursued a policy of deflation, aiming to restore the pound to its pre-World War I parity. This involved measures to reduce public expenditure, cut government debt, and stabilize the currency. And whereas I don't generally agree with austerity, and austerity measures in this situation, in the Great Depression, it maybe worked. I don't know. I'm not an economist, people. So this would be his greatest achievement. Next, we have Ramsey MacDonald, and Paul Ramsey MacDonald. So he was Prime Minister first for 288 days between January 1924 and November 1924, and then again between June 1929 and June 1935. So Ramsey MacDonald is often slated for being the first Labour Prime Minister who went into a government with the Conservatives, as we mentioned in our video on the biggest mistakes. But some of his achievements are really overlooked, and it's kind of sad to see. So his biggest achievement is arguably the Housing or Financial Provisions Act of 1924. And since I don't have notes on this, I'm going to read directly from Wikipedia. Shame me, I dare you. The act increased government subsidies to be paid to local authorities to build municipal housing for rent for low-paid workers from £6 to £9. It also extended the time over which the subsidy was paid from 20 to 40 years. Around 508,000 houses were built under this act, and the act was introduced by the first Labour government, led by MacDonald, and was known as the Wheatley Housing Act after John Wheatley, the minister who introduced it. And I think this was probably one of the better acts of this time, especially because this was during the Great Depression. I believe that investiture is probably better during these kind of situations than austerity. And I think MacDonald recognised that too, and this is one of the best things to have happened during his time, and it's probably his greatest achievement as well, aside from being the first Labour Prime Minister. Next we have Neville Chamberlain, and Neville Chamberlain's biggest mistake, as we know, was his policy of appeasement towards Adolf Hitler, and it's the one he's most remembered for no matter what. And it's because of this, it's almost difficult to find anything else that he did. Everything is overshadowed by this policy of appeasement. And, you know, in some ways, it's also one of his best strengths. And this is probably controversial to say, but I would argue it's up there. And the reason for this is because it allowed Britain time to rearm during a clearly dangerous period, and war was probably inevitable, and perhaps Chamberlain acknowledged this secretly. And yeah, this allowed Britain time to rearm at a economically sustainable pace. And in some ways, this would mean it's his greatest achievement, because it made Britain more militarily prepared for war at the expense of his reputation, mind you. I mean, he is remembered as the one who tried to appease Hitler, and it backfired tremendously, but in some ways it benefited Britain. It benefited the war effort. It allowed Britain more time to rearm, and without bankrupting the country. This was after the Great Depression, which came after the First World War. So yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this was his biggest achievement as well. We now live in a world where someone has said Neville Chamberlain's greatest achievement is the policy of appeasement, and I can promise you that the world is now officially ending. Winston Churchill, well, it's pretty obvious. His biggest achievement was his leadership and the eventual victory of Britain and the Allies during the Second World War. Churchill's leadership as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, aka his first term, particularly during the early years of World War II, is widely regarded as one of his greatest achievements. I mean, his speeches, including the famous "We shall fight them with growing confidence and strength in the air" address, inspired the British people and the Allied forces during the darkest days of the war, especially Britain, which was taking heavy beatings from Germany and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe at the time. His resolute stance against Nazi Germany played a crucial role in maintaining morale and determination. Churchill was also a vocal critic of appeasement policies before the war, and when he became Prime Minister in 1940, he steadfastly refused to negotiate with Hitler. Instead, he rallied the British people and committed to fighting until victory was achieved. I mean, it's why he's nicknamed the British Bulldog. He wanted a fight with Germany. He always believed that Hitler could not be appeased and that war was inevitable. So whereas we included in the last video that Neville Chamberlain's greatest achievement was the policy of appeasement, while also his worst mistake, it's complicated, okay? It was clear that Churchill was probably the right one on this topic, and war was inevitable and it needed to happen. Churchill was on the right side of history because he won the war, and yeah, this is easily his greatest achievement. I don't care if people try and tell you that his Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 was his greatest achievement. I'm sorry, it's not, okay? World War II kind of overshadows that. Next, we have Clement Attlee. For Clement Attlee, who was Labour Prime Minister between 1945 and 1951, his biggest achievement is easily his post-World War II reforms, and this included the nationalisation of industries. So one of the most significant policy initiatives under Attlee's leadership was the nationalisation of key industries. The Labour government nationalised industries such as coal mining, railways, and the Bank of England, aiming to ensure public ownership and control over key sectors of the economy. Most notably, and probably his single biggest achievement, though not entirely attributed to him, as Nye Bevan was the real mastermind behind it, Atleys' government is perhaps best known for the establishment of the National Health Service, or the NHS, in 1948. And the NHS aimed to provide universal healthcare free at the point of use, a principle that remains a cornerstone of the British healthcare system and is one of the most important aspects of the UK even today. I mean, the parties are still arguing over whether it should be free, whether it shouldn't be free, and funding and so forth. It remains a very important cornerstone of UK discourse, and it's one of our most treasured institutions, no doubt. And then there was the welfare state and social security. So Atleys government implemented a broad range of social welfare programs, including the expansion of social security benefits, the creation of the welfare state, and the introduction of measures to address poverty and unemployment. The post-war period also saw significant educational reforms, including the raising of the school leaving age and the development of a more accessible and inclusive education system. There was also decolonisation. Atleys government oversaw the process of decolonisation, which granted independence to India in 1947, and whereas his biggest mistake is undoubtedly the partitioning of India, granting Indian independence was a big thing, and it's attributed to Atleys and his government mostly. And Atleys government engaged in economic planning, seeking to address the challenges of post-war reconstruction and to promote economic stability and growth. He also played a role in the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949, which contributed to the collective defense of Western democracies during the Cold War. So Atleys government did a lot, and the entire 1945 Labour Manifesto would be his greatest achievement, but if I'm singling one out, it's probably the NHS. So that is Clement Attlee. Next, we have Anthony Eden. Anthony Eden was Prime Minister during a very troublesome time between 6th of April 1955 and 9th of January 1957, and his entire political legacy is tarnished, completely tarnished, by the Suez Canal crisis. And because of that, there's really nothing which stands out as being a great achievement that he did while the Prime Minister. So I really don't know what to do for him. In terms of personal achievement, he won the Military Cross and became the youngest brigade major in British Army. Yeah, that's it. He won the Military Cross by saving a soldier's life during the First World War, and that's really all I can give him, because his time as Prime Minister is really overshadowed by the Suez Canal crisis. And I've looked, I've researched, I can't find anything special. So yeah, sorry Anthony Eden, that's just kind of where you are, my friend. Next we have Harold McMillan, who was Prime Minister between 1957 and 1963. And for me, he's not one of my favourite Prime Ministers, but he has a significant achievement in the form of the Wind of Change speech.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. And we must all accept it as a fact.
So the Wind of Change speech was delivered on February the 3rd, 1960 during a visit to Cape Town, South Africa, and this speech is widely considered a pivotal moment in the history of British colonial history, and specifically the decolonisation process. So, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, many African nations were gaining independence from colonial rule. This is well known. The process of decolonisation was underway, reflecting a changing global attitude towards imperialism and the right to self-determination. And Macmillan acknowledged this. His speech acknowledged the profound social, political, and economic changes taking place in Africa. He recognized a wind of change blowing across the continent, symbolizing the unstoppable force of African nations seeking independence and self-governance. He emphasized the British government's commitment to the principle of self-determination for African nations. He declared that the United Kingdom would not stand in the way of African countries choosing their own destinies and governments. While recognizing the inevitable shift towards African self-rule, he also highlighted that the British Empire would continue to have a role in the world. He envisaged a commonwealth of nations where former colonies could maintain close ties with Britain while enjoying independence too. And the Wind of Change speech had a profound impact on international perceptions of British colonial policy. It marked a departure from the traditional stance of imperial dominance and signalled a recognition of the legitimacy of African aspirations for independence. So yeah, for me this is his biggest achievement, and it's a good one, so well done Harold McMillan. Next we have Alec DouglasHome, who was Prime Minister between 18th October 1963 and the 16th October 1964, and he didn't have much time to do much. In fact, he spent most of this time as Prime Minister just trying to continue with the policies of the former government under Harold McMillan, which had collapsed under the weight of government scandal and sleaze, and DouglasHome failed to really impose himself on the government. He didn't achieve anything of note, and it's hard to sum up what would be his biggest achievement. And due to the government being in such severe decline at this time, and the Conservative Party itself being torn apart by scandal and factionalism, I'm going to put his biggest achievement as the general election defeat in 1964. And this is because he only lost by a very slim margin despite all of the scandal, and despite Harold Wilson coming up as a younger, more modern opposition. So I'd say this was DouglasHome's best achievement, and I would go so far as to say he did pretty well in the election considering everything that was going on. So this is the only thing I can give him, I'm afraid. Sorry, DouglasHome. Next we have Harold Wilson, who was Prime Minister on two two occasions, the first being between 1964 and 1970, and the second being between 1974 and 1976. And there are many achievements which he achieved during this time, and it's kind of difficult to place one. I mean, he introduced the Open University, which was a significant initiative under Wilson's leadership, and it aimed to democratize education and make higher education more accessible to a broader segment of the population. He expanded educational opportunities, such as the Open University in 1969, and it provided distance learning and higher education opportunities to a wide range of people, including those who did not have traditional access to university education. There were social and economic reforms. These reforms aimed to modernize the British economy and society. The government invested in education, introduced measures to improve social welfare, and pursued policies to boost technological advancement. Perhaps most notably, in 1967, Wilson's government took steps to decriminalize homosexuality in England and Wales with the passing of the Sexual Offences Act. And this was a significant social reform that contributed to the advancement of LGBTQ plus rights in the UK. So yeah, I'm willing to use most of the education reforms as his biggest achievement, or with the decriminalization of homosexuality in there too. There are many things he did very well while Prime Minister, and I'm willing to go with education reform as his biggest achievement. Next we have Edward Heath, or Ted Heath, and he was Prime Minister between 1970 and 1974. And for me, his biggest achievement, and this will be controversial to some, his biggest achievement was the successful negotiation and entry of the United Kingdom into the European Economic Commission, or the EEC, in 1973. This marked a major step towards European integration and had long-lasting implications for the UK's relationship with the European Union. And I think it actually modernized the UK in many ways. It improved its reputation. Before we joined this, we were nicknamed the sick man of Europe, for crying out loud. So I think this was a good thing. He did a couple other good things too. I mean, he introduced various social policies and included the establishment of the Department of the Environment and the creation of conservation areas. I mean, it's the Conservative Party. They should be conservating the environment. So yeah, I'm willing to suggest that his biggest achievement was the EEC, or the UK's successful negotiation into the EEC. Next we have James Callaghan, who was Prime Minister between 1976 and 1979, and he's probably one of my less favourite Prime Ministers, if I'm being completely honest with you. And it's hard to think of something great that he did. He was, through no fault of his own, was a Prime Minister during a very tough time economically for the UK, and it's kind of difficult to pick one. I'm going to go with... See, normally in this situation I would go for the cop-out answer and say that he handled the economy and the UK well during a tough and turbulent time, but it was very bad. We know about the winters of discontent. That was what we put as his biggest mistake in the last video. And yeah, I'm going to go with the fact that he held the four great offices of state. He's the only politician to have done so. He served as Chancellor, as Home Secretary, as Foreign Secretary, and as Prime Minister. So I'm going to give this as his biggest achievement. I mean, he tried to make efforts towards devolution for Wales and Scotland. There was the Scotland Act in 1978 and the Wales Act in 1978. So as a Welsh person, I like this, but it didn't even achieve full devolution. So yeah, I'm going to go that he held the four great offices of state. And next, Margaret Thatcher, nicknamed the Iron Lady, was Prime Minister between 1979 and 1990. And as I said at the end of the last video, I'm not a big fan of Margaret Thatcher, okay? I'm not a big fan. As we've mentioned in the past, people in the north and people in Wales and Scotland tend to have a dislike of Thatcher and her policies, and I am one of these people. I make no attempt to hide that, and whereas I've been able to hide some of my political stances throughout the rest of these videos, I mean, I had someone accusing me of being a monarchist. Now, I ain't going to get into that one today. But Margaret Thatcher, it's a little bit more difficult to hide, but I'm going to put her biggest achievement as winning 3 general elections. This was pretty unheard of at the time. I mean, it's happened in the past, maybe. But her dominance as a electoral force is still to be respected today. I mean, there were times when Labour was supposed to be the successor. Neil Kinnock, God bless him, he tried many times. And yeah, it just didn't happen. And even in 1992, after Margaret Thatcher, the Tories still held on. And even despite Margaret Thatcher's admittedly controversial and polarizing reputation, she still won 3 elections. So I'm going to put this as her biggest achievement. And now her economic policies, I'm not too fond of. I mean, economic reforms is what she's probably most known for, and Thatcherism is a term still used today to describe the economy. It's still Thatcherist in many ways. So you can argue that this would be her greatest success if you are on the right side of the economic reforms. For me, not so much. I'm not a big fan of them. It was a free market reform. It was deregulation and a commitment to reducing the the role of the state in the economy. If you are this way inclined, then this might be her biggest achievement. You might like her privatization policies. So there is the extensive privatization of state-owned industries, including the privatization of British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, and various other utilities. And again, if you are pro-privatization, this might be your favorite. And if you're anti-trade union, you might like Margaret Thatcher. So there's much to be discussed. For me, not a big fan, and I admit that. So I'm going to go for her success as a political campaigner as her biggest achievement. And next we have John Major, who was Prime Minister between 1990 and 1997. So I hate to use another general election victory as a biggest achievement, but for John Major, for Thatcher, you can argue there's a bunch of other things. For John Major, his premiership is not often viewed as a particularly great one, and he was mostly just a continuation of Thatcher with perhaps a little bit more social awareness. But the 1992 general election victory stands out as his biggest achievement simply because he was not expected to win that, and it was a major upset in British politics. In fact, it's probably one of the biggest upsets in British political history because the Tories had been in power at this point for 13 years, and Thatcher's government ended in disaster. She had to step down, she had to resign, and then John Major took over a government viewed to be one which was in serious terminal decline. Neil Kinnock was looking popular choice for leader at this time, and yeah, it was not expected to go this way, and it was a very depressing night for Labour. For the Conservatives, there was a shock, fantastic win for them as they won 336 seats to Labour's 271. And as I said, pundits were suspecting that it would be either a Labour victory or a hung parliament. So for the Conservatives to win like this was a pretty impressive feat, and it stands above all else for John Major. So this is his biggest achievement, undoubtedly, in my opinion. Next, we have Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister between 1997 and 2007. Tony Blair gets a wrongful reputation for being some kind of continuation of Margaret Thatcher, and I think this is unjustified. Now, his negative reputation gained from the Iraq War is perhaps more justified, but even so, I still think there is much good that he did within Britain, and undoubtedly, his biggest achievement for me is the introduction of a national minimum wage. And Blair's government introduced a national minimum wage pretty early on in 1999, and it sets a statutory minimum wage for workers. This policy aimed to address income inequality and improve the economic well-being of low-wage workers. This was a great policy, and I think this was, in my opinion, his best achievement. Now, there are others which could come up too. You could say his 1997 general election victory, which gave Labour a huge majority, was up there, and it ended 18 years of Conservative rule. This was pretty impressive. If you are a certain way politically inclined, you may say that his transformation of Labour and introduction of new Labour was a good thing. You might say that devolution for Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, this for me is one of his best things, and it marked a significant shift in the UK's constitutional structure. You might say that his social and welfare reforms were among the best. You might say the Northern Ireland peace process, which concluded with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, was one of his best achievements. There are many things you can give to Tony Blair, and I sometimes feel sad that he is viewed as a succession of Thatcherism, because I don't think he is. So for me, the minimum wage is his best achievement, and that's what I'm going to use right now. So yes, well done, Tony Blair. And then lastly, we come to Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister between 2007 and 2010. Now, this is perhaps unfair to Gordon Brown because many of the achievements we just gave to Tony Blair, we can attribute to Gordon Brown too, because he was the Chancellor of Tony Blair, but in a much different manner, because he was essentially an unofficial co-Prime Minister. He was that powerful as the Chancellor. He's nicknamed the Iron Chancellor, which is a nod to Bismarck. So for Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, it's a little bit unfair to judge him because he didn't get as much time as he wished and as many would have wished for him. And unfortunately, his time as Prime Minister was dominated by the global financial crash, which weirdly gets blamed on him, and I don't even know why. So for me, I'm going to put his biggest achievement as Prime Minister as his leadership during the global financial crash of 2008. And it's often considered one of his defining moments. But in the face of a severe economic global downturn, he took decisive action to stabilize the UK economy and address the impact of the crisis on the financial sector. He worked closely with international partners to coordinate responses and advocate for measures to prevent a deeper recession. In the G20, he took a leadership role. He played a prominent role in the global response to the financial crash. As the leader of one of the world's major economies, I think Britain was 5th or 6th at the time, it's usually neck and neck with France, he actively participated in G20 summits and urged coordinated international efforts to address the economic challenges facing multiple nations. And it's a shame he lost the 2010 election, mostly because of the financial crash and some other things.
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman that said she used to be Labour. I mean, it's ridiculous. I don't know why she's Susan.
But it's really unfair to blame it on him because it was nothing to do with him, and he tried his best, and I think he did a good job managing the British economy during this time. So for me, this is his biggest achievement. And that concludes this series. Thank you very much for watching till the very end. We enjoy making these Prime Minister series, so there probably will be more again in the future. We'll find other things to attribute to them. Yeah, if you want more, then please follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Collective Histories page, and on Instagram at instagram.com/The Collective Histories, and on X/Twitter at twitter.com/Collective Histo. And if you really want to go the extra mile and you want to quench my thirst, then please buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Collective Histories. And if you do that, then we'll be very grateful to you and we'll be best friends for life. So yes, we'll be back on Wednesday for the next video. We don't know what it'll be yet, but it's gonna be something different, I think. We might even branch out of UK politics this week. We don't know. Anyway, we'll see you then. Have a lovely start to the new year and see you on Wednesday. So goodbye.